On the 10th of December 2012, A4ID's Responsible Business Group met to discuss the role of lawyers in social impact investing. In this recording, you'll hear from Rhiannyd Griffith and Ranajoy Basu, both from Reed Smith LLP, who explain the structure of investment funds and social impact bonds.
So my name's Rhiannyd Griffith. I'm an associate in Reed Smith's investment funds team. And I thought before I kind of launch into a couple of examples of investment fund structures that we've seen used in a kind of development context, I'd go back to basics and just do a quick run through about what an investment fund actually is for anyone who doesn't have kind of funds experience, and how lawyers can get involved in advising in these types of structures. Michelle has actually covered some of the kind of concepts that I'm going to talk about, but if you want to kind of ask me from an English perspective what we kind of see, then go for it at the end. So an investment fund is basically a vehicle, so either a company, a partnership, or a trust, which allows investors to pool their money together to then be spent on whatever the manager of that fund thinks will make them money. In a social impact context, there's also the added kind of factor of the money will be spent on whatever the manager thinks or the investors think will have a positive social impact or will benefit kind of most people. Each fund is tailored to meet the requirements of the various investors, sometimes to meet the requirements of the manager. So, for example, the type of entity you use, its jurisdiction, whether that's Delaware, Luxembourg, Cayman, UK, whatever, and how complex your structure is will depend on the various requirements of the entities involved. And one of the first ways that lawyers can get involved from a fund's perspective is to discuss with various interested parties what structure will best suit their needs, like DECA have done for Elios. What do funds invest in? Essentially anything. You can see from my very mature pictures that the fund can invest in whatever will either make money or have an impact. So examples we've seen are financial instruments, hedge funds, for example, invest in derivatives generally, private equity, so unquoted companies, debt, commodities, other funds, real estate. Infrastructure is a biggie at the moment, especially in the UK, and aircrafts and ships, so or kind of chunky assets that form part of a business chain. Typical impact investments that we've seen recently are private equity, so small businesses, very small businesses that are struggling to raise money elsewhere, either because they're kind of not attractive to donors for risk reasons, and for the same reasons not attractive to commercial investors. So they're in that kind of patient capital stage where no one actually wants to give them money, but they're doing a really good job. Infrastructure projects that relate to development, so kind of water projects in India, for example. Renewable energy, solar is a big one we've seen recently. And my particular experience, drug research and development. One of the funds I acted on the establishment of was dealing with a lack of funding for early stage oncology development, which apparently was not receiving the funding that it kind of deserved because of the risk and the length of time it took to make a return. But, I mean, basically anything. And the structure of your fund might depend on your underlying asset. So what can lawyers do? I mean, our role will tend to depend on whether we're acting for a manager or a sponsor like Elios, or whether we're acting for an investor like DFID or EIF, or a big charity or an investor coming into the structure. For a manager looking to set up a fund, we'll typically give structuring advice, which will include, as I've said, advice on an appropriate jurisdiction for the fund, the tax status of the fund, which will normally be a big consideration for investors who don't want double tier tax at the fund level and the investor level, although actually with impact investors this tends to be less of a consideration because they're either charities who can gift aid back to their kind of parent charity, or institutional investors like the World Bank or someone who's tax exempt, so less of a driver here. Regulatory advice is always a biggie because, as Michelle said, if you're managing someone else's money, a regulator will normally want to know about it, be it the FSA or the SEC or whoever your local regulator is. You can't generally say, give me your money, I'll look after it, without someone saying, well, I need to look after you. So especially when managers are looking to set up small funds, it's often difficult for them because there's no de minimis regulation level. So whether you're managing kind of £100,000 or £100 million, you're still going to be subject to oversight, which in a small manager's case can be rather burdensome. So we tend to advise on the least onerous where you can do what you want to do without being subject to too much of a regulatory requirement. Yeah, like I said, the structure of the fund might depend on the liquidity of your assets. So whether you have a kind of PE, private equity style partnership fund where investors come in and then stay in, or a slightly more liquid structure where you can come and go as you please, or depending on how quickly you can sell the underlying stuff, will be a consideration. I'm going to move off this. Cost is often a consideration, especially on small kind of startups. We can advise on the incorporation of the relevant entities. So you might want to start up a manager entity. You need to incorporate your fund entities and any underlying kind of either share classes or portfolio companies on an investment by investment basis. We'll help drafting offering documents. So a manager might have a concept for a fund and then want to go out fundraising, not to banks but to interested investors. So we'll need some kind of memorandum or prospectus type document saying what it is they do, how that'll make money, setting out some of the basic terms, and all of that is subject to some relatively strict regulatory requirements. I'll jump onto fundraising advice actually, because often it's a shame because often the people most interested in investing in these structures are the people who are most protected by the law against investing in them. So that the less sophisticated your investor, the less able you are to promote an investment fund structure to them. So average Joe on the street who might want to invest in something that's going to have an impact is going to be protected from hearing about it. So we'll normally have to advise managers on the range of people they can promote their funds to, which is often restricted to institutions or other sophisticated type investors. And then we can advise a manager on kind of ongoing deal flow. So if you're buying and selling companies, if you're doing debt investments, if you're investing directly in infrastructure, there'll be legals involved in all of that, which, as Michelle was saying, is great for lawyers who want to get involved in pro bono, who don't want to do kind of shed painting or something that doesn't necessarily use their skills. From an investor perspective, we'll be looking normally at structures that either already exist or that are being set up for either that investor or investors of that type. So we'll advise on the terms of the fund as they already exist, in terms of once your money's in, how do you get it out, what information rights do you have. Reporting specifically in an impact fund is an interesting one, and I don't think there's a kind of a typical approach here, because how do you properly measure impact? And what happens if you're not having the impact you thought you were going to have? It's a lot less clear cut than if you're making a return of X. I get to know about that because I can see the numbers. And legal opinions. An investor will want to know that a fund structure is set up in the relevant jurisdiction appropriately, and there's nothing essentially legally wrong with what you're putting your money into. So example one, my great PowerPoint skills. This is a fairly simple example where you've got a fund entity, you've got the orange kind of investors coming in, these can range. Management normally investing a stake because investors would like to see management having some capital or at least a kind of interest in the performance of their fund. Manager at the side and investments at the bottom. A lot of people here have got experience in different kind of development projects. The structure of your fund, although it will probably be impacted to an extent by the type of underlying investment, it won't necessarily be different if you're investing in the developing world or the developed world. The considerations of asset type and investor type and structuring will tend to be the same wherever you are in the world, essentially. This is an interesting example because this is something that's happening at the moment. We're not acting on it. I don't know if anyone here is. So we've got a commercial, purely corporate fund of funds with bank investors or probably kind of commercial investors. The fund of funds invests in other funds, and those underlying portfolio funds invest in whatever, purely on a profit basis. The typical fees is a fund of hedge funds. So the typical fees in this type of structure, you'll have a 20% performance fee based on the increases in net asset value month to month or for whatever calculation period, and then a fixed management fee of 2% calculated based on assets under management. And the manager in this structure and the underlying managers have agreed to waive their 2% and donate 1% to charity and 1% or kind of allocate 1% into an impact portfolio, which will then be managed by an impact manager. So it's an interesting way of using using a purely profit structure to allocate. I mean, if this has got 500 million under management, 2% every year is going to be a fair whack to either charity or to this impact portfolio. And the manager is still incentivised to make money for its investors through its performance fee. So for the investors in this structure, it's great because the manager is going to be even more inclined to make money for them. And that's actually it on funds. We've got Ranajoy on bonds.
So, hi everyone. I'm Ranajoy. I work with Rhi. I'm from Reed Smith. We've got something called a social impact finance group. Just to give you a bit of background. So she works with a lot of the fund investors, you know, the actual investors into some of the very interesting projects that Andy and Michelle spoke about. I'm a capital markets lawyer, and I get involved in a lot of the structuring aspects in working with the fund investors in terms of sort of what they're looking into from a structuring perspective or when a deal is being negotiated, but also from a perspective of putting some of a capital market or a banking transaction together, which basically gives these fund investors an opportunity to invest in. So I think over the next 5 to 10 minutes I'll tell you a little more about social impact bonds. Firstly, whether they should be called bonds in the first place, and I'll explain. So essentially what a social impact bond is, it's a financial technique. It's an arrangement which you strike between, you know, one or more government agencies with an external organization which issues funding to raise capital, but also sometimes called an intermediary. So what happens is that, you know, from a documentation perspective, you'll have the intermediary and the government agency entering into a contract called the social impact bond agreement, where, you know, you stipulate some very, very stringent terms in terms of addressing a particular social problem within a specific time, addressing a specific population which is numbered, and also sort of having in that documentation a clear way of measuring how to gain, at the end of that period, how you assess whether your project has actually been successful or not. And at the bottom level, you have, so between the intermediary and the investors, and there are other participants, you have a separate set of documentation which you enter into, which describes the arrangements from the intermediary and the other service providers. And that's because, unlike traditional bonds, and this is where, you know, it's called a social impact bond, it's slightly a bit of a misnomer, because your traditional concept of a bond is typically where over a period of time you would have, investors would expect to get a return, sometimes a guaranteed percentage of a return. Whereas this product, a social impact bond, is completely performance based. So at the end of that period, if the objective or the goal that you're trying to achieve, the social issue that you're trying to address, is not met according to a set criteria, then the government agency doesn't pay down the amount which the intermediary then can use to pay the investors. So typically, from a cash flow perspective, what happens is the intermediary will try and raise funds with people like Rhi's clients, for example, who say, we've got a great opportunity, this is what we're trying to do, and they issue bonds. And I suppose that's where historically this concept of social impact bond has come from, because at the lower level, where they try and raise the funding, it's sometimes on the basis of impact, sort of retail bonds, where they have the flexibility of reaching out to a wide variety of investors. And when I say a wide variety of investors, when it's a social impact bond, these products have traditionally been invested in by impact investment funds. But it could also draw the attention of investors who are, a client put a very, very interesting term, used a very interesting term the other day. He said they were socially agnostic, haven't heard that before, but basically who were not typically fussed about the social benefit side of things, but definitely wanted the overall project, the overall objective of what you're trying to achieve to work. So that's basically the structure. So again, just remember there are a couple of criteria from the government agency side to the intermediary. There's one set of documentation which sets out the outcome, the timeline, the payment, and in fact so your main participants are your government agencies, the intermediaries, the investors, and who then transfer the money to the beneficiary population. There's also another key player in this diagram, actually, which is not reflected here, which is an independent assessor. Because one of the questions is, so who assesses whether at the end of, say, 6 years or 8 years or 10 years' time, whether the project has achieved its outcome? So in most cases, they have an independent, a third-party assessor who will again come up at the beginning of a structuring phase. He will his methods of assessing whether how he's going to assess that outcome is set up right from the beginning. So you don't get into a situation where in 10 years' time or in 8 years' time, when you come up to assess whether your project has actually achieved its outcome, you sit there scratching your head thinking, does this work? Have we really achieved as much as we were supposed to? Does this mean? Because payment from the government agencies hinge on outcome. So that is an absolute critical feature to consider and think about if any of you at any point look at the structuring of any of these deals, or even from an investor perspective. So I just thought it would be useful to. So that's basically the concept of a social impact bond. It's designed to address a very specific social problem or social issue. And historically, and when we talk to social impact investors about this as well, the feel we get is that at the time when they're sort of structuring these products, a lot of the issues in the market at the moment that they're trying to address are issues that are high on the government's agenda. So they want to track an issue, and then they see that as a problem, and then they structure this product to try and address it over a definite time period to measure the outcome. So some of the key terms that we see driving the documentation perspective at both levels is something like, for example, the first one, the broad responsibilities with flexibility to achieve targets. Now, what that addresses is that the government will obviously try and keep a check on the intermediary, that it wants to sort of see that after during the course of the transaction, there aren't things that the intermediary does which sort of railroads the project at the time that you come for repayment at the end of 10 years. But it's a fine balance to have, and there's a fair amount of discussions which need to go, which are involved at that stage. Because remember, the intermediary sometimes needs to employ third-party service providers who are actually going to be involved in the intervention. And as a government, with my government cap on, if I try and impose too many restrictive terms, which allows them to, for example, appoint third-party services or service providers, then what happens is it's a real problem for the intermediary to be able to stick to remember, it's a very specific timing within which they're trying to achieve the project result. So if those terms and conditions are too onerous on the intermediary, it sort of restricts the amount of flexibility that they have during the course of the runway that they've been given, essentially. So that's the first one that one needs to consider in terms of the discussions with the government agency. Second one is the time frame and the population to be served. And the devil really is in the detail, because, depending on sort of the social issue or the social dynamic that you're trying to address, there are different issues. Now, when you deal with a group of people, for example, if you're dealing with, for example, the Peterborough bondage with, I think they had about 3,000 prisoners who were sort of let out of jail, and the transaction was a bit about that if they did not re-offend during a specific period of time, the amount of money that would be saved by the government, that would be assessed and calculated in terms of addressing, what the ultimate social benefit, the outcome would be. So, but it becomes very difficult when you're in terms of, because it's not an exact science. You're dealing with a social problem, and you're dealing with a particular time frame and with a particular group of people. So there are a lot of key considerations go into actually assessing how one addresses, what a successful outcome will be. So the first one is, general terms to try and run the transaction. The second one is how you assess. The third one sort of links with the second one. But the third bullet point really is in terms of your independent assessor. Remember, because there must be a clear way that all parties agree. So if you're an investor, it's very critical that you understand that on the basis of which, at the end of your 5-year, 10-year bond period, you will basically have almost like a report card being presented saying that this project has gone off well, it's gone successfully, and it's achieved the outcome. And we're still in early days with this product. It's very interesting. The earliest one, the Peterborough prison bond, I think comes up for payment in 2014. So it's going to be very, very interesting to see sort of what happens. But at the same time, we're seeing a lot of innovation in the market in relation to this. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm and genuine interest from investors, whether they're independent or individual investors or corporates or funds established principally for this particular purpose, to see if they can sort of invest in these products which have a social outcome. So that's the next one. And all this basically, remember, the intermediary plays quite a critical role in these transactions, because they have to align the motivations, the interests of the government agents, the underlying investors, the service providers, to make sure that during the life of the deal, that all runs smoothly, and that all the various interests are aligned in the documentation, so to be able to sort of provide a workable product towards the end. And it's interesting to already see that the way our US counterparts are addressing some of these issues is slightly different to what we in the UK or in Europe are looking at. For example, I was talking to a fund investor the other day, and he was very, very keen on investing in this particular product. But he said one of the key things that I, as an investor, would look to is I also want to see that my money is being utilized the way I want, the way they've told me it will be used. So if I've got a pot of 100 which I want to invest over 10 years, I want to see that at the end of 5 years, for example, they will actually build the first phase of the school that the project said they will do. And if they haven't done it by then I want features and structures in there which makes me which gives me an exit, so that I won't need to put in my next amount of money and next amount of investment if I already know that the project is not achieving its initial targets. But remember, from a government agent's perspective, it's almost like no win, no fee lawyers. You win at the end of it, you get the result, you get the money. But from an investor's perspective, he's already in with his money, and he wants to see how the project is progressing on a day-to-day level. So he doesn't want to wait till 10 years' time to see whether he's actually going to get his money back or not. He wants it even before that, at 5 years' time. And so in the US, we've seen that investors are looking at this differently. the similar product that they did to the Peterborough prison bond in New York already has, which was arranged by Goldman Sachs, and I think there's already a feature where the Bloomberg Trust sort of wraps the transaction, so sort of guarantees payment if certain features happen. But this is basically the overall, a very broad aspect of what a social impact bond is. I wouldn't be too hung up on the word bond. There are various features. It's a very flexible product. It's also a great product for innovation because you can really use it to address a number of very, very important issues. I mean, just last week, Social Finance, I think, closed a deal an impact bond which addresses social housing issues in the Essex County, for example. There's already one which is being designed for prisons. So it's a great product. There's a lot of innovation. But if any of you at any point get involved in the structuring, just remember that there are key considerations depending on which part of the transaction that you come in, which needs to be carefully reflected in the documentation, so that you have the flexibility as well, whether it's before during the running of the transaction or at the time of repayment. So that if you're an investor, for example, a lot of the guys we work with in the funds team, these guys, they're very driven by the double bottom line, so that not only do you get a reasonable amount of return on your investment, but at the same time you also see that a social outcome has been achieved to address a particular need. So I'll take any more questions.
That's all. Thank everyone on the panel.